There's one more little forensic audio tool that I really love that I've been using lately that I want to talk about. And I'm just going to do this on the snare top track. And that tool is called, there's several, there's certainly various brands that'll do it, but I use the Sonal Keysys or whatever DQ1, which is at first glance kind of intimidating. A whole lot of knobs and buttons and switches. But what this is a dynamic EQ. It's different than like a multi-band EQ or a compressor. But what it does is it allows you to dial in a frequency band and then set sort of a high and low threshold, and then based on your volume envelope, it will adjust the gain of those frequency bands. So imagine you're working with like a regular type of parametric EQ. You sort of set it at a certain frequency, and then you've got your hand on the volume control, and every time the snares hit, you either turn up the volume or turn down the volume or do something like that. Or there's also the ability to, every time the snare drums hit, you turn up the volume, but when it's not being hit, you're turning down the volume. So it's a neat tool to kind of go in and add further control of the tonal shape of an instrument based on the volume envelopes. So let's check out just our soloed snare track. So just the top mic. Okay, so there's a little bit of leakage from hi-hats and cymbals into the snare, and let's see if we can remove some of that. So what I'm going to do is go in with a high shelf EQ, and I'm going to first put it in static mode. And static mode means that it's not a dynamic EQ, it's just a standard EQ. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to sort of did some work ahead of the game here, but I set my attack and release kind of fast. And then over here, my standard EQ controls where I find the frequency and the bandwidth. So what I've done is I've found some of the harsh sizzly stuff that I don't want in my mix. And then now I'm going to switch into dynamic mode so we can remove some of that sizzly stuff when the snare drum's not being struck, and then boost maybe even a little bit of that sizzly stuff when the snare drum is struck to kind of add some air and snariness to this top snare mic. All right, so let's listen to this in bypass and then turn it back on. I'm being very heavy-handed with it right now. In reality, I don't do more than a dB or two in either direction. I'm just doing it heavy-handed now so you can really hear the difference. So we've brightened our snare without bringing in any additional cymbal leakage. I might even use all four bands of this stuff. In the upper mid-range, I might, and actually I can do that pretty quickly. Let's bypass that high one and just listen to the upper mid-range for a second. First in static mode with a fast attack and a fairly fast release. And let's find some of the harshest cymbal stuff in the snare track and then notch that out. All right, so that's some of the crap. Let's do a similar sort of thing back in dynamic mode, and I have to dial in my thresholds a little bit. Okay, let's hear that bypassed and not. So I think I had I can't remember what I used on the snare on this record, but there's that typical like off-axis dynamic mic sort of kind of cymbal sound that I don't find particularly ear-pleasing, and this is a way to remove some of that. So, and I also might do some sculpting with the low mids and the lows to sort of add punch without too much additional resonance. But let's try just hearing both the high and high mid together and see how that affects the tone. And I'm going to actually sort of ease up on my settings on all of this stuff, since I do feel like it's quite heavy-handed. So quite a bit different. You have a whole lot of control there. It's super powerful, but it's also, really easy to mess up the signal. So be careful if using that tool. So I like to use a lot of master faders in my studio. So I'll take, as you can see in this Pro Tools session, I have now 3 kick tracks, but I only really have, my main console is only 16 channels. So I will send all 3 of those kick tracks onto one fader of the console. I want to make sure that, so all 3 kick tracks will be assigned to the same hardware output, but I want to make sure that I have plenty of headroom everywhere, so I will make a master fader in Pro Tools which is assigned to the same output as those 3 kick tracks. So I have both a way to know if I'm clipping the internal summing bus in Pro Tools on that output, and I also have master level control of all the kick tracks. And then even further, I have an ability to use more plug-in inserts on the master fader. So one plugin I really love to use on drums to make drums super aggressive is the Soundtoys Radiator plugin. I first started using that when I was mixing a band called Toxic Holocaust last year, and they wanted like extra distortion on everything. They're like, oh, the guitar is just recorded with distortion, but we want more. And the drums were recorded super hot, but we want more distortion. So I made master faders, so I had master control of the kicks and snares, toms, all that stuff, and could then apply that radiator to the master faders of those. But you can do that if you're working in the box. You can do that with aux masters. You can assign your 3 kick tracks to an aux, and then you can have an aux input that those 3 kick tracks feed into, and it gives you master control over the kick drum using the one aux fader and the aux inserts and even additional sends from that aux channel. Okay, right now I'm really just doing mix prep, so I'm not doing a whole lot of that stuff yet. But I do like to do, aside from the parallel compression that I set up in the box with the kick turbo and the snare turbo, once I get out to my console, the compressors that I like to typically use on my kick and snare tracks actually have wet-dry controls. So within one channel, I'm able to do a parallel compression kind of vibe on the kick, snare, and toms. So it allows the natural character of the performance to come through, but sort of reels it in a little bit. And like I stated earlier, I like to be sort of light-handed at several stages rather than heavy-handed at one stage. So I'll have several different stages of light parallel compression, which, at the end will give you a nice level control and tonal adjustment of the drums without too many compression artifacts. Sometimes you like the sound of compression artifacts, sometimes you don't. I don't usually. I want to feel the performance more than I want to feel the engineering process in most cases. So I tend to choose more gentle techniques. Okay, so ambient mic treatments. Well, the first thing you need to decide, and this is very much dependent on the sound of the song and the aesthetic of the band, is do you want to capture most of your drum tone from the overheads and or the room mics, or do you want to capture most of the drum tone from the close mics? I think it's very dependent on whether or not you're dealing with a wall of guitars or whether you're dealing with a little bit more open guitar tones, and also just the feeling that you're trying to capture, and very much the way that a drummer plays and what their internal balance is. If a drummer just sounds perfectly balanced and great in a room, they're hitting the drums all at the right volume in relation to the cymbals, then you might not need to use the close mic techniques as heavily as just bringing up the overheads and or the room mics and capturing the bulk of the drum sound from that. I do tend to treat the room mics and the overheads differently based on whether I am kind of making the close mics the foundation of my drum sound and then backfilling that with overheads, or if I'm going to make the overheads the bulk of the drum sound and then backfill with close mics. I already talked about pre-delay, so I'm going to kind of skip that for now. But if the bulk of my drum sound is going to be overheads, then I'm not going to thin out the bottom end of the overheads nearly as much as I do if the bulk of my sound is close mics. I also probably will limit the overheads a little bit more heavily if the bulk of my drum sound is coming from the close mics. Sometimes it's actually a problem that if you want a close mic sound on a drum set, that the snare drum is too loud in the overheads. That's actually an argument. You saw me yesterday sort of measuring out the distance between the two overhead mics, making sure it's equidistant from the snare. Sometimes that's actually a hindrance when mixing a super wide cymbal setup or super wide sounding cymbal panning scheme where you want to rely heavily on the overheads. Sometimes if you actually have two different distances from the snare, it'll naturally put the snare a little bit out of phase in the overheads, which can open up a hole in the center channel for the close mic to live. If you do have super phase coherent overheads and you want to make a hole in the center channel for the overheads, you can use some fun EMS techniques, or you can limit the overheads. If you have access to an MS type compressor, a lot of the like the Fairchild 660 type compressors, which there's a few plug-in versions of that, have a lat vert control on it, which is an MS compressor which essentially gives you independent control of the center channel versus the side channels. You can kind of compress the center channel, get the snare out of the way of the close mics. So I will handle overheads and room mics drastically different based on where the primary drum sound is coming from. And I don't have time to get too detailed about that now, but just do a ton of experimentation and see what works in the context of your rooms and the songs and with the preference of the band. For EQ, I mentioned this kind of with every instrument, but low-mid content of overheads and room mics very much affects whether it's in front of the speakers or behind the speakers. So use that low-mid control to balance that presence, how in the face and how in the crowd you want it to feel. Usually less low mids feel a little bit more modern, and in some cases a little bit more flattering and sort of set things on a sound stage. More low mids tend to feel a little bit more raw. Gating is not something typically done with ambient microphones, but I do actually want to talk about that because this is something interesting. I really enjoy gating my room mics. And the way that I like to do that is I typically do it after I've edited the toms and once I've set up a snare turbo. I don't have a snare turbo set up yet, so I'm just going to do that from the primary snare mic. But I will do a bus send. Let's do bus 11 sounds good to me. And let's set that to be pre-fader, 0 decibels. And then now let's also copy that onto our rack high by pressing Alt and grabbing the bus send and onto the floor high. In theory, I've already edited the floors and snares for the whole song. This isn't going to be super accurate because I'm not dealing with gated edited ones and it's the raw tracks. And then I'm going to go down to my big room mic. And let's solo the big room mic and put a go to the dynamic stuff, and then we will put let's use the digigate. Okay, so bypass it for a second. Refresh your memory on what this microphone sounds like. Cool. Now let's do a sidechain thing. So I'm going to enable the sidechain by saying I want the key insert or the key input, and then my key input is going to be that bus 11. So now the gating threshold on these room mics is no longer controlled by the audio signal within the room mic, but by the external sidechain. So I'm sending the signals from the snare and the toms into the external sidechain of the gate, and I'm going to use that to control I'm going to use that to control how this gate operates. So we've got this little handy tool just to monitor what the sidechain is within this plugin. So let's hear that. So that's the signal that's going to control the gate on the room mics. I'm not going to bother to use any of these filters on there, and I'm going to set the hold and release super fast to start with, and then the attack. If you remember from yesterday, we actually calculated what the offset was between the snare mic and the room mics, and it was about 15 milliseconds. So I'm going to start with my attack at 15 milliseconds. Otherwise, when the snare causes the gate to open on the room mic, it'll actually, since sound moves slow and electricity moves fast, it'll actually open the gate 15 milliseconds before the room mics hear the attack of the snare. So I'm delaying the attack by that offset. So let's hear what that sounds like. Let's start from the beginning of the song because it's a little slower. Sounds pretty weird, right? But let's start adjusting our thresholds and particularly our range and ratio, and hear how that sounds. Okay, so that's pretty gentle. What this does is this helps remove cymbals and room mics, cymbals from the room mics. So we're getting more drum tone from the room mics and a little bit less cymbal tone. And I'm going to increase the release time a little bit just to get a little bit more decay out of that. And then let's take a listen to that in bypass and then with it enabled. It's a bit more heavy-handed than I usually do, but you can hear how it does clean up the sound of the room mics a little bit more. It makes it a little bit more snare and toms focused. And then after that, I might want to let's just throw on a quick compressor just so we can hear how that will affect the tone of the rooms. 1176 is a classic choice, and they let you do you can do the all button thing, which is, I'm shift clicking this thing to do the all button thing, and let's set the attack and the release pretty fast and see how adding some compression to room mics affects her tone. So it needs to be used sparingly, but it certainly adds more of a sense of a bombastic kind of vibe to it. I'm not going to use that on my mix because I actually already did some compression on the way in. But if you don't compress on the way in, you might want to compress your room mics after doing the gating. Otherwise, if you do it before the gating, you're just going to be, it's going to make it harder to gate and it's going to be messier. Now you've got a bunch of gear going. You want to double check all your polarities, make sure that the snare polarity is still it has an optimal relationship between its close mics and its overheads. Otherwise, you'll get a thin sound. It should be pretty obvious. But yeah, so double check that. The final thing that I wanted to talk about, and I'm just going to go ahead and take the gate off of this guy, leave that, I'll leave the gate on, take the compression off. The final thing that I wanted to talk about was this convolution reverb concept that we talked about yesterday, where I actually made reverb impulses of this actual room that the drums were recorded in. And in addition to gating the big room mic, I still want to have further control of the balance of cymbals versus close mics on it. So I am going to go back up here and do an aux send from my snare top mic. I'll just do the snare for now, but eventually I might send all the close mics to it. But let's set this bus to be a new track, and let's call it room verb. And yeah, that looks good. So create it, and I'm gonna. This looks different. Oh, let's just let's use let's say bus 13, 14. Bring the volume up to 0. Okay. So now I'm sending out of the snare track, out of snare top onto bus 13, 14. I'm going to go down next to my big room track, and I'm going to make a new track and call that a stereo aux input. And I'm going to call that room verb and make the input bus 13, 14, and then the output is be this raw tracks output that I'm using for all of my raw tracks. And let's solo the room verb, and just so I can hear the reverb all by itself, I'm going to go over and make this a pre-fader send, so I don't have to have the snare drum track soloed in order to send a signal to the room verb track. So now I don't have a plug-in on that, and I'm hearing the snare come up on the room verb track. Now I'm going to open up a convolution reverb plugin, which I haven't used before, called Hofa or something. There's a whole bunch of different convolution reverb plugins. I use one called TL Space at home, but essentially they should all work about the same if you have the same convolution reverb impulses. So I'm going to load an IR file that is on the desktop in this thing called impulses. So I got a bunch of different impulses here from some hardware reverbs, as well as the big room, the close room, and the overheads of my studio. I have this one called Mix, which is actually a balance that I did of my big room, close room, and overhead mics. I use that a lot, but I'm just going to go big room for now. It shows you kind of, since it doesn't have a super long decay, it's showing you this sort of graphical representation of what the profile looks like. So let's hear that. So that's basically what a snare drum sounds like in my bathroom. Now let's combine that along with our big room track and see how it sounds together, and we'll try to find a nice balance of the two to get some extra snare drum in the room tracks without bringing up the cymbals. All right, so hopefully you're listening to that at home on something where you can discern a difference. You don't have to use a convolution reverb for that. If your room doesn't sound particularly good, you don't feel like making your own reverb impulses, you can use all sorts of different things. Actually, you know what? Let's do one other quick thing. One thing that I used to use before making my own reverb impulses was for this purpose, the Yamaha, oh, I misspelled that. It should be SPX 90. Which is a real old, crappy, I think 12-bit reverb that was a standard in the 80s. Doesn't sound particularly good on its own, but adds this kind of gritty room tone to things that I really like. And I have a gated setting on this, which is a super short reverb. So it's adding some ambience without adding too much decay. So let's hear how that sounds. That's both at the same time. Let's hear just the SPX 90 impulse that I made. Not that cool on its own, but in combination, sounds pretty good. And you should be able to find a balance that's pretty convincing between the real room mics and your fake room mics, so that it doesn't feel canned, but has a little bit more ambience and more independent control of close mics and overheads. And I think that with that, we've reached the end of what I like to do for drum pre-mixing before I start really tweaking the tones of the drums.